everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
There are fewer fish in the sea now than there used to be. And some animals, including sometimes perhaps the cephalopods, have benefited from that by becoming more abundant. But we're not only harvesting fish, we're harvesting shrimp, we're harvesting crabs, we're harvesting clams. And so as we harvest more and more from the ocean, there are fewer animals in the ocean, and it is less rich than it used to be. And when we think about that evil twin of climate change, which is ocean acidification, as the CO2 in the atmosphere builds up, the CO2 in the ocean builds up. Most of the CO2 we add to the atmosphere ends up in the ocean. Adding CO2 to the ocean makes it more acidic. As it becomes acidic, it becomes very, very difficult, increasingly difficult for animals that have hard shells to grow their shell, because that reaction, that growth physiology is dependent on precise control of pH. So we're going to see the failure of snails and clams and to some extent echinoderms and crustaceans, the failure of those animals to be able to lay down their own skeletons and grow. And as that happens, and it's already being measured, we can see it not just in the lab, but in extreme weather events right now in the oceans. As those systems fail, not only are we harvesting out all the food for octopuses, we are also reducing the ability of those foods to grow through their natural life cycles and to get big. And so one of the things we don't know this for a fact, this is speculation, but one of the things I suggest in the book is that as the oceans become more depleted, as climate change reduces the ability of animals to find food, to escape their predators, to grow quickly, not only will we see fewer animals, which we're already seeing, animals will fail to grow as quickly. And so we're going to see the maximum size of these animals decline as their food becomes scarcer, so that the giants that I write about in Many Things Under a Rock are going to be, or maybe already are, increasingly hard to find.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. David Scheel, Professor of Marine Biology at Alaska Pacific University. Welcome to the show today.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So, David, you have been educated in biology, animal behavior, and ecology, and have done extensive field work all over the globe, including Yellowstone National Park, the Serengeti National Park in Tanzania, and Alaska, to name a few. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of background.
Yeah, I have that education you described. I got a biology degree and then went to graduate school, and I was working in terrestrial systems at the time. I worked over in Serengeti National Park on African lions and their sort of system of migratory animals that they prey on, and that formed the basis of my PhD thesis work. And then I did some other work in global climate change, and moved over actually after that to marine work, where I eventually started to specialize in the behavior of octopuses.
And that's a solid past 25 years that you've been focusing on specifically the Giant Pacific Octopus, I believe. Now, one of the experiences that you have, my understanding is that you've worked with Native Alaskans, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how working with them helped you to understand or better understand the octopus ecology, and this, as well as discover new species.
Yeah, when I came to Alaska, it was a few years after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and I part of my job was to work on looking at what had happened and to bring sort of an independent science eye to that, and there was a call for proposals that would work in the Alaskan Native communities. Um, the oil, when it spilled, it traveled across a pretty wide swath of coastal Alaska, and there was oil on the beaches on over 1,000 miles of shoreline, and so the communities that live along those shorelines are a lot of them are Alaskan Native communities, and the Alaskan Natives have a rich cultural heritage and a need to harvest foods from the environment, and the coastal communities, of course, they harvest a lot of their food from the oceans. And so within that context, collecting octopuses in the intertidal was a pretty important subsistence cultural resource for Alaskan Native communities. And I was contracted to try and take a look at whether what the status of those octopuses were in those habitats following the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And ultimately, we weren't able to say much about the impact of the oil itself on octopuses, because there had been no previous data that had really been collected for contrast, sort of a pre-oil spill, post-oil spill kind of thing. And so we ended up just doing what we could to characterize the habitats that octopuses lived in, the things they needed out of those habitats, and the effects that different changes in the environment might have on octopuses.
So you make an interesting point of not having prior data before that spill, but I think I got to believe that some of the research did give you some pretty interesting insights nonetheless. And how did that really increase your curiosity even more? And when we think about octopus, we think about a very small subset of the 300 different species. But your world that you've been studying is a lot broader and more diverse, right? So tell us about that.
Okay, I started in Africa, in Alaska, and the most commonly seen and harvested octopus up here is the Giant Pacific Octopus, which is can be a pretty big animal. And there's a section in the book, Many Things Under a Rock, The Mysteries of Octopuses, where I talk about just trying to figure out how big is this animal that we're going to have to cope with, because we were trying to put scuba divers down to collect the animal. And so we had intentions of handling it underwater on scuba gear. And so that's just a complicated situation to be on a scuba gear, which is a life support system for people underwater, and then to be trying to handle an animal that potentially could be as big as the person trying to handle it. And we didn't want to use anything that would damage the octopuses, because we were very interested in collecting data from healthy animals and then releasing them. Over the years, I gradually developed opportunities to work in different places with other species of octopuses. And so I've done some work in the tropical Pacific on the day octopus, Octopus cyanea. I've done some work down in Australia on another species, Octopus tetricus, because it felt like it would be useful and interesting to expand my horizons and not just be focused on just this one species that made up the bulk of what we were looking at here in Alaska. And then along the way, my students and I also sort of we were working with a geneticist to get some genetic information about the species, Giant Pacific Octopus. And the geneticist reports came back and said, well, it's great. You've got a very interesting species here, but it looks like there's another species that no one's noticed tucked in amongst the genetic data. But the original samples that we'd only taken small biopsies of the animal. We didn't have the whole animal to look at anymore. And they were collected from fishermen who'd used it for bait or released it or whatever. So we didn't have good observations of what this other genetic signal actually looked like. So we had to go back and collect whole animals, bring them into the aquariums, and begin working with the live animal. And then we immediately realized we had two different species. And so we were privileged enough to document a species up here that no one had really noticed before, even though now that we can look for it, it seems like it's fairly common and fairly large.
Very interesting, really is. And you were talking about how some of these great large Pacific octopus can be as big as a human. So how did you guys overcome some of this challenge of trying to capture a live animal and do it in a safe manner, both for the octopus, but also the diver as well?
Yeah, there's a reasonable number of, reasonable number of techniques you can use to sort of minimize the difficulty. But what really happened for the most part is that the octopuses we ended up working with were overwhelmingly juveniles. And the juveniles, you can get up to 20 pounds or so. But we found a 20-pound octopus on occasion in the intertidal. And if they're not tucked into a den that you can't get into, you can pick them up without too much harm. It's the challenge of being underwater with them that creates particular difficulties to be careful with the animal and with yourself and your divers. But yeah, we just adopted a policy of safety first, safety for the octopuses, safety for the people, and only subsequently do we worry about whether or not we're going to get a data point.
Now, over the last 2.5 decades, you have developed quite a bit of expertise in this category. And there are, of course, kind of superficial information that mainstream may know about octopuses, but can you go into some of the different facets or dimensions that makes them really unique and interesting?
I was intrigued by octopuses. I think we all are, because they have similarities that allow people, I think, to maybe identify with them. They have big eyes, they're very expressive body changes, and they're very curious animals. And at the same time, and overlying that sort of identification, we also have this sort of visceral horror reaction to them, if you will. 8 sinuous creeping arms, a beak buried where we can't really see what it's up to in the mouth, in the musculature around the mouth, slimy, living underwater in the dark, in the abyss. And so they simultaneously in people evoke these sort of feelings of curiosity and affinity, and feelings of revulsion and trepidation. And so that creates a very interesting space to try and figure out how do they work, because they're simultaneously familiar and alien. And I think that much of the book, Many Things Under a Rock, tries to cope with that dichotomy. They have exquisite vision, but they don't see color. Instead, they see the polarization of the light. And that's actually probably much more useful for many species of octopuses that live in the water. Polarized water tends to break down the polarization of light over short distances. And so anything that's strongly polarized is probably fairly close underwater and highly relevant. And so if they can see that in the same way that we see a contrast of like red and green, they don't see color, they see polarization, but it pops out for them visually in their world. They have exquisite senses of touch, and also on the suckers, chemical reception that is analogous to our taste or smell. And so as they're crawling across the bottom, they're sort of tasting and feeling the bottom as they go. And so that just makes for some very interesting ways of encountering the world that are in some ways similar to ours. But then simultaneously, they're Their nervous organization is distinctly different than ours. Their brains are different, and the ways that the things that are important to them are different. So, one example there is the difference between seeing color and seeing polarization. It seems like maybe they live in a monochromatic world, and we think that's, less rich. But in fact, underwater, there's not as much light, color wavelengths of light, because of the way light absorbs color wavelengths. And so they live in a very rich visual world that's illuminated by polarization instead.
So you've been mostly focusing on kind of the physiology or the anatomy of the octopuses. But let's talk about their intellect as well as their ability to communicate and even have social skills.
Yeah, one of the surprising things that's developed in octopus science over the last 10 or 20 years maybe is how they manage their interactions with their own species. Octopuses generally live solitary lives. And so, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, we understood octopus biology as the biology of a solitary animal. And there have been some changes recently in which we've found octopuses that are living and sort of living next to each other and sort of forced to cope with one another, and have, it's been surprising for an animal that's been taken to be solitary, how communicative and interactive they are. So down in Australia, south of Sydney, I work at a site in Jervis Bay. And at this site, we have sometimes recorded thousands of interactions between octopuses in a single day. And those interactions, they don't fall into that many different categories. But for an animal that has been conceptualized as this solitary animal that doesn't interact with others of its same species, to see them doing anything with others of the same species 1,000 times a day is pretty shocking. And in those encounters, we see things like animals reaching towards one another, animals displaying at one another and sort of signaling intentions or signaling what's going to happen next. We see octopuses gathering material and throwing it at one another. We've seen occasional fights, but remarkably few compared to what we might have expected. And so this gives rise to this notion that the octopus is a solitary animal, yes, but they are sometimes better off putting up with the fact that other solitary animals are living near them. And then in those situations, they're forced to interact, and they have to manage all these interactions with conspecifics. And they are a very behaviorally rich species, and that shows up in their social dynamics as well. They have an incredible repertoire of behaviors they use to interact with one another.
So to be clear, some of these interactions, would you say they're more negotiating territory, food, or resources? Or are we talking about actually something like collaboration, cooperation?
Yeah, I think we're in early days yet of understanding what they do and being able to document it. One of the things that's allowed us to see this stuff that we're seeing now is developments in scuba technology, aquarium technology, and underwater camera systems, all of which in the last 20 years have become much more affordable, much more successful, and much more ubiquitous. And so we're documenting things that happen in the water that we would not have seen in the 70s or 80s or 90s even. And that's allowed us to see these behaviors that are not rare necessarily, but maybe aren't the norm for octopuses everywhere. So I do think a lot of what they're doing is managing space and managing access to mates. So at this site that we look at in Jervis Bay, the most active individual is usually a large male. He's having most of the interactions. He seems to be trying to exclude other males from the area. He seems to be trying to manage the behavior of females in the area. But females are also interacting with females. Males are interacting with males. Males are interacting with females. There is some mating going on, but we see interactions that appear to be like when a female wants to get up out of her den and go foraging, we see the male taking an interest in that, maybe trying to discourage her from leaving. We see the female trying to react to that discouragement, trying to skirt around and so on. We also see the male doing things like as an octopus approaches the area, the male, this large active male, will often go to the edge of the habitat patch and meet whoever is approaching. And generally, that behavior happens with the approaching animal approaching in a rather low posture that is generally associated with giving way or not standing your ground. It's not an aggressive posture, and it's highly conspicuous once they assume it. And the male, this large active male who's in sight, generally approaches in a very tall, broad, sort of dark stance that is associated with standing your ground, not giving way, sometimes aggression. And so we see this kind of signaling going on. And then when the two animals meet, generally right at the edge of the habitat patch, the male generally will either escalate and become more large and more firm in his stance, or all of that display and posturing just suddenly sort of collapses and he accompanies the other animal back to the den. And what we think is happening is he's greeting familiar females and, you know, he's checking them out basically. And if it's a familiar female, great, right back to your den, which is where the female was going in any case. If it's a male, then we begin to see this exclusion behavior. And we're still working through all of that. You know, none of that's published yet, but I talk about it a little bit in Many Things Under a Rock. And so we're seeing these really kind of complicated dynamics of managing interactions. So that's what we have today. But at the same time, there are reports, for example, of cooperative behavior between octopuses and fish when they have different capacities to extract a potential prey item from the reef. So in that case, octopuses do seem to be cooperating. And the difference between the cooperation between a fish and an octopus and the non-cooperation, if you will, that we're seeing between octopuses is that the fish and the octopus have different capacities. And so they can help one another and they can both benefit. The two octopuses, unless they're doing something that from which cooperation can lead to higher rewards, there just isn't any incentive for them to cooperate in those kind of ways, because each of them individually can get the food they need. Each of them individually can build the shelter they need or excavate the shelter they need, so that we don't see that that need to be cooperative. At least so far, but it's early days still.
So very interesting, and excited to hear more about the upcoming research areas as well. Now, the audience are probably wondering, how does an octopus or octopuses help us to give a glimpse of what's happening from a climate change perspective? And I think specifically there was mention of UK. So I wonder if you could talk to us about what's happening there.
Yeah, there's several things that are related to climate change in Many Things Under a Rock, and the first is a focus of an entire chapter in which I talk about some data that's been collected up here in Alaska, in which we find that following warmer winters, we generally see a decline in octopus numbers. This is a cold water species. If the waters warm up, the oceans are probably less productive. That drop in productivity means that there's less food and more predators for octopuses. And so we see fewer octopuses recruiting into the habitats where we're able to survey them, the scuba diving in onshore habitats. Now, for a warm water species at the northern edge of its range, like we see just south of England at the mouth of the Mediterranean, the species there is Octopus vulgaris, the common octopus, and its general range has been just south of the tip of England. And as in warm years there, when the winters have been especially warm, then they, in the past, in 1900 and in 1950, they have seen these huge outbreaks of octopuses that just outnumber everything else, it seems like, in the ocean, invading the waters on the southern tip of England. And so fishermen report, being able to catch nothing but octopuses. If they cut up the octopuses and use it for bait, they just catch more octopuses. They talk about having so much harvest that they ended up just like making mounds out of the carcasses on the shore just to, it's kind of it was a problem. There were so many octopuses, it was a problem. And I heard a brief mention that I haven't chased down yet, that it might be going on again this year. And there's an interesting scientific paper that attempted to model the distribution of Octopus vulgaris as the climate warms up, and has this animal expanding its range northward. And so what this kind of tells us is that as the climate warms, some octopus species are going to lose ground, like up here in Alaska. Some octopus species may shift their ranges, moving northward, and change the dynamics of the areas that they're moving into. Overall, in the period of 1950 to about 2000, it looks like between the harvest of big fish from the ocean, which are octopus predators and competitors, and the beginnings of the global climate change signal, that cephalopods overall have become more abundant, not less, globally, across all these species. But from 2000 to 2023, we may have reached the limits of that. It's hard, it's too soon to say. And my suspicion is that those gains will begin to fragment as we see cold water species like the giant Pacific octopus here in Alaska starting to have a negative impact from climate change. So that's the first thing in the book.
Yeah. So do you foresee that the cold water species could potentially, over time, maybe not necessarily face extinction, but to get to a point where it's alarming for scientists?
In some ways, I think it's alarming already. The sites that I've been studying from 1995 to 2016, 17, 18, it's very difficult to find octopuses at those sites now. From 95 to about 2016, I don't think we ever had a year when we went out and just found very little sign of octopuses at all. And our funding situation has changed and our research intensity has changed, but in the few times that we've been able to get out in the last 5 years or so, there's almost nothing there. And so, to some extent, I've written a couple of papers that are effectively saying, yeah, the time is here. We're already seeing declines in octopus abundance. And that brings me to the second point, the way that climate change and human activities are affecting the oceans. There are fewer fish in the sea now than there used to be. And some animals, including sometimes perhaps the cephalopods, have benefited from that by becoming more abundant. But we're not only harvesting fish, we're harvesting shrimp, we're harvesting crabs, we're harvesting clams. And so as we harvest more and more from the ocean, there are fewer animals in the ocean, and it is less rich than it used to be. And when we think about that evil twin of climate change, which is ocean acidification. As the CO2 in the atmosphere builds up, the CO2 in the ocean builds up. Most of the CO2 we add to the atmosphere ends up in the ocean. Adding CO2 to the ocean makes it more acidic. As it becomes acidic, it becomes very, very difficult, increasingly difficult for animals that have hard shells to grow their shell, because that reaction, that growth physiology is dependent on precise control of pH. So we're going to see the failure of snails and clams, and to some extent echinoderms and crustaceans, the failure of those animals to be able to lay down their own skeletons and grow. And as that happens, and it's already being measured, we can see it not just in the lab, but in extreme weather events right now in the oceans. As those systems fail, not only are we harvesting out all the food for octopuses, we are also reducing the ability of those foods to grow through their natural life cycles and to get big. And so one of the things we don't know this for a fact, this is speculation, but one of the things I suggest in the book is that as the oceans become more depleted, as climate change reduces the ability of animals to find food, to escape their predators, to grow quickly, not only will we see fewer animals, which we're already seeing, animals will fail to grow as quickly. And so we're going to see the maximum size of these animals decline as their food becomes scarcer, so that the giants that I write about in Many Things Under a Rock are going to be, or maybe already are, increasingly hard to find. And this is a known effect of harvest and food depletion in marine populations, that we're basically creating natural selection pressure for the evolution of smaller body size, because there's less food, because there's more predation from fishing. And we're doing that to fish, and we're doing that to octopuses.
Yeah. Early this week, there was an article that came out on Nature that talked about different approaches as countering acidification, some of these issues that are really affecting marine life all over the world.
This is edging outside of my area of expertise, really, but I do think that the current notion that we see, particularly with young people these days, is this great alarm over the carbon economy, the fossil fuel economy. And I think it's taken American society, US society in particular, a long time to wake up to this. This was something that I remember talking about when I was in graduate school in the 80s, and we recognized the perils, we ecologists recognized the perils of global climate change at different levels and in different ways at that time. And, I was working on this in mammal populations or in the early 90s. But the political world could not be persuaded. Right. And, it goes back before the 80s. I mean, people were talking about climate change in the 50s, I think. And the political world could not be persuaded. But I think we need to persuade the political and particularly in the US, we need to persuade the commercial world. Right. And it's not just burning carbons, it's also turning carbons into all of the materials of our world, our use of disposable plastics, the addition of carbon to the atmosphere, and the addition of carbon to the oceans, which causes acidification, is a triple threat from the fossil fuel economy. And the most optimistic piece of news that I've encountered recently hasn't seen a great deal of press, actually, and that was the discovery that natural hydrogen may form in the earth very commonly. But it forms in areas that don't form fossil fuels. And so we don't necessarily, our energy industry hasn't necessarily been exploring for this. But the hydrogen that forms is a product of heating water with geothermal heat in the earth. And it's renewable in the sense that as long as you have the heat in the water, the water separates into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen is quickly taken up by the iron in the Earth's crust, And in the right circumstances, the hydrogen can accumulate. And if we could figure out an industrial economy that burned hydrogen instead of fossil fuels, when hydrogen burns, it doesn't create carbon dioxide. You combine oxygen from the atmosphere and hydrogen from as a fuel, and you get water. And so, this is a vision of an energy intensive economy that doesn't require any carbon pollution. Whether that's feasible or not, I'm completely outside of my expertise. Whether it exists in the quantities that we would need, I don't know. But it was just one of those pieces of science that made me think, wow, that would transform all of our debate about how the world should continue to thrive without continuing to live in the fossil fuel economy.
That's a great conclusion and summary. Thank you for that, David. And I couldn't agree with you more. There are, of course, active hydrogen projects, but it requires really starting with clean energy generation, whether it's wind or solar that gets converted. So with that, I've been joined by Dr. David Scheel, Professor of Marine Biology at Alaska Pacific University. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.